Sean, for leading us in those beautiful songs. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for being here this beautiful Sunday night. Ed, thank you so much for filling in for me. And I would thank Steve for filling in the class, but he is not. Where is everybody? They're out of town. Terrible, terrible, terrible. It's great to be back. I missed y'all this morning. Lakin sends her regards. She misses everybody as well. I got about 4 hours of sleep on me right now. It's really great. And I'll tell you something else. I don't have a sermon. And I'll tell you why before you get mad at me, all right? The sermon that I was going to do this morning was going to be one of my two-parters that y'all like so much. And I was going to do it tonight, but then Lakin told me not to because we might be here for an hour or so. I don't really know how long it would take. And so tonight, what we're going to do is we're going to go into the book of Daniel. And we're going to do our class as we do on Sunday mornings. In Daniel, we are in Daniel chapter 5, and we have gotten fairly far along in the book of Daniel. We're in chapter 5, and we're going to be starting in verse 5 of chapter 5 this evening. And so, this will be just like every Sunday morning. I don't want to speak the whole time. I know you know that. And I know you don't want to listen to me speak the whole time. And so, in Daniel chapter 5, let's just do a little recap because we haven't been here in a while. It's been about a couple weeks since we've been here. And so in Daniel chapter 4, what happens? Well, Nebuchadnezzar got humbled. And Nebuchadnezzar got humbled badly, right? He has a vision of a great tree that is, the greatest tree that ever tried to be a tree. And that represented him, but that tree was going to be cut down. And that is exactly what happened to Nebuchadnezzar in verse 28 of chapter 4. He was driven from civilization. He lost his kingdom for 7 periods of time. Probably 7 years is what I am where I am at right now. And so this happened, why? To humble him. To show him that, yes, Nebuchadnezzar was the greatest, most powerful person in the world. Yes, he had one of the most powerful empires that ever existed, but it was only because of God that he was there. God allowed Nebuchadnezzar to expand as he did. God allowed him to take the Jewish hostages. God allowed him to do all the things to grow strong and mighty. And Nebuchadnezzar needed to be reminded of that. And so at the end of chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar ends his little speech that he was giving, because chapter 4 is mainly from the perspective of Nebuchadnezzar. He ends his speech by saying, "I praise and exalt and honor the King of heaven, for his works are true and his ways are just, and he is able to humble those who walk in pride." And so after this, in chapter 5, we have a little time skip. We're jumping around in time a little bit, and we come to a guy named Belshazzar. Right? Who was Belshazzar? Son of Nebuchadnezzar. Absolutely. And I did some more research, and I did a little bit more digging. There's actually 2 ideas about who Belshazzar was. He could have been his son, or he could have been his grandson, because there are a few historical findings that say that his father, Belshazzar's father, was actually Nebuchadnezzar's son, but he didn't last very long on the throne at all. And so Belshazzar became regent very early on in his life. And so there is... Ed?
I was going to say, if we look down into verse 11, maybe it sheds a little light on it more, perhaps, but there's a man in your kingdom, and the queen is telling Belshazzar this. There's a man in your kingdom, and of course it's talking about Daniel, and then mid-verse, and King Nebuchadnezzar, your father, she repeats it twice,
Mm-hmm. And so, a lot of times, not a lot of times, sometimes, when we're talking, Jesus calls himself the Son of David, right? Or he's called the Son of David. He's not actually David's son, but it's very likely that he was Nebuchadnezzar's son. It's also a possibility that he was his grandson. We're not entirely sure. The historical records aren't, all there. But we do know that he was a descendant of Nebuchadnezzar, and that he had forgotten, and here's the important part, that he had forgotten about God. That he had forgotten about all of the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. That he had forgotten, and when I say forgotten, I mean he didn't care, right? He chose to forget all of the things that had happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And so in verse 1, we find Belshazzar the king held a great feast of 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. And when Belshazzar tasted the wine, he gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple, which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple and the house of God, which was in Jerusalem. And the king and his nobles, his wives and his concubines, drank from them. They drank the wine and praised the God of gold, silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. And so, although the God of heaven worked miracles through Daniel, though he worked miracles through Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, though he allowed Daniel to interpret dreams, and he gave Daniel wisdom that the Chaldeans said was of the gods, right? And remember, they are a pagan society, and so they believe in all sorts of gods. Even though God, our God, allowed all of these things, Belshazzar, I don't know how to say his name, but Belshazzar forgot. And we talked last time about, why that was. Why do children, our descendants, our children, why do they forget about God so easily? And why do they not keep his name? Why do they not keep the faith? And, we explored that in the first 5 verses 2 weeks ago very, very thoroughly. And so we're not going to go back to that. But I want us to have a picture in our minds about what was going on. We're having a feast, 1,000 of his nobles, their wives, their concubines, everybody is there. Everybody who is anybody's there. They are drinking from the gold and silver vessels which Nebuchadnezzar brought from the temple, religious artifacts, religious sacred items, and they're defiling those. And they were praising the gods of gold, silver, bronze, stone, and wood, and so forth. This was a terrible, terrible party. And then we get to where we're going to start for the night. In verse 5, besides the talking donkey that we read about in the Bible, this is probably, to me, one of the strangest accounts that we have in the Bible. In verse 5, we read, "Suddenly the fingers of a man's hand emerged and began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. The king's face grew pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints went slack, and his knees began knocking together." I just want you to have a picture. You're drinking, you are having a great time, and then all of a sudden, on the back, back there on the back wall, or for y'all, right there, you just see a hand. Right? You see the back of a hand. And that hand is just writing something. This hand isn't attached to anything. It's just a hand. It's like the thing from the Addams Family. The hand, I can't remember what his name was. Hand? Okay. The thing was, it was the Shaggy thing, right? Cousin Ed. That's right. Yeah. And so you have the hand, right, from the Adams family just sort of floating around. It's just writing on the wall. And Belshazzar probably had about the same reaction as most of us would. Now, some of us might go get a gun and shoot it. I don't know how much that would help, though. But his knees started buckling. His joints went slack. I mean, he fainted. He's pale. He lost all of the color in his face. He is terrified. With good reason, I think. You know? And so, in verse 7, the king called aloud to bring in the conjurers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king spoke and said to the wise men of Babylon, any man who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple and have a necklace of gold around his neck and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. And so Nebuchadnezzar brings in all of the people that he thinks can help him out, right? The diviners, the Chaldean, the sorcerers, the conjurers, all of these guys that knew something about something, right? And he tells them, if you can read this, if you can decipher what the hand wrote, then you're going to be second down from me. You're going to be the third ruler of the kingdom. That's how seriously this guy took these events. And so, you would think that with all of these great wise men in the same room, that somebody would come up with something about what the hand wrote. But in verse 8, all the king's men came in, but they could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. Why do you think that was? Just a curious thing to think about. Why do you think that they couldn't decipher the language? God didn't allow it? That's probably it. Yeah. God didn't allow it. It might have been written in a language that nobody had ever seen or heard of. Might have been written in English. I don't know. Ed?
Later in the chapter, when Daniel interprets that, in verse 25, and he says what the message is, that these terms are the financial terms that are often was used in Persia. And that's important.
It is important.
There's going to be a transition here in the next bit, and we're going to see that that's the end of the Babylonian captivity. And
because of a very
Medo-Persian empire at hand. So talk about handwriting on the wall, seeing the proverbial handwriting on the wall. God is demonstrating through something that is just so beyond miraculous. I mean, that's
oh yeah.
Not just a hand, just have the fingers of the hand up. What's that all about? What attention do I need to pay to that? And so when Daniel knows and he describes that, interprets that, that this is
it's a prophecy in itself. As we'll get to it in a moment. We might get to it. I don't know. I'm not going to keep y'all, past 9 tonight. So we'll see how far we get. But yeah, they couldn't read it, and it was a very important thing that was about to happen. A drastic turn of events in the course of history is about to happen, and so nobody could read it. And then in verse 9, the king Belshazzar was greatly alarmed. His face grew even paler, and his nobles were perplexed. And so he's starting to panic, right? He's starting to truly feel the fear. But then in verse 10, and guys, y'all listen to this because this is good advice. The queen here gives him some good advice, and I've learned in my almost 6 months of marriage that you should just listen to your wives. Because they give good advice. Miss Sharon, you're nodding your head. Absolutely. But in verse 10, the queen entered the banquet hall because of the words of the king and his nobles. And the queen spoke and said, O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you or your face be pale. There is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom, like the wisdom of the gods, were found in him. Excuse me. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the magicians, conjurers, Chaldeans, and diviners. This was because of an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of enigmas, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. Isn't that exactly what you want to hear on a resume, right? Daniel, the queen comes into the king, and she says, don't worry, don't fear, don't fret. You have a guy here that can interpret this. And I think that spoke well of Daniel. Obviously, God is still with him, right? He has gone through Nebuchadnezzar's kingship. He is now in Belshazzar's kingship. And yet, God is still with him. And God will continue to be with Daniel throughout the rest of his life. That is one of the key themes of the book of Daniel. If you have faith in God, if you trust in him, if you give yourself to him, right? It's not, you can have faith that God is real, and you can, trust that he is real, but giving yourself to him, right? Daniel was completely God's. And we'll see in chapter 6 that no matter what happened, Daniel was still going to be completely God's. And so, if you give yourself to him, God is going to be with you. God was with Daniel. God was with Joseph. God was with Moses. He was with all of these great men of the Bible and women as well. And he will still be with us. One of the saddest things in the world is that we can sometimes forget that God is still here. With everything going on, our lives, we get sidetracked, we get busy, we get nervous, we get anxious, we get stressed. And sometimes we forget that God is here. But God is not gone. God is still here with us today, just as he was then. And with him, all things are possible, right? And he will take care of us. Maybe not here, maybe not physically, but he will take care of our souls. He will take care of what is truly important. Paul said that bodily exercise profits a little, but what profits much? Godliness. Being God's is what it is all about, guys. No matter what happens. And Daniel, the reason why I love the book of Daniel and the reason why he is probably my second favorite character in the Bible, person in the Bible, is because he never forgot that. We talk about Joseph being somebody that the Bible doesn't really have a bad thing to say about. Daniel's another one. They don't want me to talk. They want me to stop talking. And so y'all need to talk a little bit more. But the queen comes in. She tells the king all about Daniel, his abilities given by God. She says that he has a spirit of the holy gods in him. And remember, they believed in Jehovah God, but they also believed in all these other gods as well. And so she is, she's still not there, right? She still doesn't completely understand, but she knows that Daniel can do these things because of God's, right? But it is because of our God. Ed?
I was just noticing, maybe I didn't notice it before, but there in verse 10, when the queen says these things, "O king, live forever." Don't let it spook you. Don't let it, don't let it bother you. It's going to be okay.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he's already sealed his fate.
Yeah. I mean, verse 30, you know. And tonight was a bad night for the king of Babylon. This night was a bad night for him. First he was terrified, and then he did make it to the next morning. But we keep reading. And does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions about anything we've said so far? We're about to sort of transition into the good stuff, right? All of it's good, but get to see Daniel again. That'll be fun. All right. In verse 13, Daniel enters the scene, right? And so you have Belshazzar's great feast with 1,000 of his nobles, his wives and his concubines. And then you have the hand writing on the wall, the literal fingers of a man's hand writing on the wall. The king is absolutely distraught. He's terrified. He doesn't know what to do. All of his wise men come in. They don't know what's going on. The queen comes in. Everybody who is anybody is there. And then comes in a little Jewish boy. He's old now, but he is still, a Jew. He's still a child of God in a place of absolute debauchery and paganism. And so, in verse 13, we read that Daniel was brought in before the king. The king spoke and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" And so he asked, "Are you Daniel? Are you this guy that I've been hearing about?" In verse 14, he says, "Now I have heard about you that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the conjurers were brought in before me that they might read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message. But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom." And so the king is so terrified of this that his proposition is no longer, it's not just for his people. It's not just for the Chaldeans. It's not just for his wise men and his diviners. It is now for Daniel. Mickey?
I think Belshazzar was kind of remembering back what happened to his father.
Probably.
When he saw the writing and then no one could interpret for him, then I would imagine it was pretty scary.
Probably. I mean, there's a lot of
What happened to his father.
Mm-hmm.
And so he was not looking forward, I would think, what's going to be coming his way.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would say so. There's a lot of parallels between what is happening right now in the night that this account is, and years before when Nebuchadnezzar was king. And so he was there, probably as a small child, and even if he was too small to remember, he probably wasn't. But he had grown up with that. He'd grown up with stories. Ed?
Verse 22 says that, yet you, his son, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all.
Mm-hmm. So he knew. He knew. One way or another, he knew about all the things that happened to Nebuchadnezzar. And yet, like we said before, he still allowed his heart to turn to all these other things. And we talked about this last time quite a bit, and so we're not going to beat a dead horse even more, but this is a serious problem that the church faces. One generation, has God, and we've seen this throughout, every generation. But one generation has God, they know about God, they trust in God, they belong to God, and then for whatever reason, the next generation, they don't know God. And it's not like that for everybody. If that was the case, then the church would have died out a long time ago. But so many younger people today and older. But so many people have forgotten God, even though, back before them, they knew God. And it's a problem that was going on here in the 6th century BC. And it was a problem that was going to be happening everywhere else for as long as God allows us to be here. And so, we have to look at their examples. We need to look at the example that Belshazzar is setting for us. And there are some examples that we need to follow, right? Like Jesus, Paul, Peter, all of those guys. But then there's examples that we need to do the exact opposite of what they did, right? This is one of them right here.
You think if God had done the Bible, what he did to Nebuchadnezzar, that people would maybe change some of their ways? I doubt it.
Well, if Biden...
Biden all of a sudden had hair like feathers of an eagle and talons and ate grass and
Yeah.
what, there's a lot of things that they're taking the Bible out of this country.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the Bible's been being took out of this country for years now. Not
Necessarily Biden, but if he'd have done it to a leader of the country or the world or whoever was in charge of some great power,
Mm-hmm.
they didn't get there by themselves.
Yeah.
God allowed it.
Yeah.
And then if that happened in this day and time, that happened back then, do you think there would be any kind of different consequences? Different outcomes?
I don't know. This is a hypothetical question, of course, but hypothetically, Jesus talked about it though. Jesus talked about these things. The Pharisees came to him. The Jews came to. I can't remember where it was. I'm just going off the top of my head. But the Jews came to him, and they asked for signs. They asked for miracles. They asked for wonders. Show us these things. Show us you're the Messiah. And he says, you still wouldn't believe. You still wouldn't truly believe. And so, he addresses that. And we are the same today as we were back then. And so I'm not entirely sure that it would...
It also says that if everything had been written down that he had done, there would not have been enough books.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Not enough ink in the sea.
So people
Mm-hmm.
adhere to it, and they still don't.
Yeah. You got to remember, Jesus walked the earth. And he did so many things that we won't know about until we are with him, And yet people still killed him. There's a sickness in this world, and it's called sin. And sin takes us away from God. And sin separates us from God. And the bad thing about sin is it wouldn't be a temptation if we didn't want to do it. We wouldn't be tempted by sin if it wasn't something that we desired or something that we liked or something. The list can go on and on.
If you think about it, sin's easy.
Sin is easy. It is. But being a child of God is worth it. Ed?
Satan has always been sly and trickery and all of that. And
Mm-hmm.
one of the verses said in 2 Corinthians 4 that Paul points out that says in verse 3 that even if our gospel is veiled, it is veiled to those who are perishing,
Mm-hmm.
in whose case the God of this world has blinded the minds of the unbelievers that they may not see the light of the gospel or the glory of Christ, who is the image of God.
Mm-hmm.
Now they could, you can overcome that.
Oh, yeah.
This term, blinded the minds of the unbelievers, this is a military term.
Mhm.
It's a smoke screen.
Yeah.
And Satan did it back here during Daniel's time with
Mm-hmm.
King Nebuchadnezzar. He worked his way through that.
Mm-hmm.
And had a good outcome. But Satan was working on Belshazzar, is how you pronounce his name, to just blind his mind.
Mm-hmm.
But that's no excuse.
It's not.
Accountable.
Mhm.
Less accountable.
Satan was here in the garden. He tempted Adam and Eve. He tempted them with something that they wanted, right? He's good at it. He knows what he's doing. He understands what makes us tick, right? But we got to remember, Satan has no more power than what we give him, what we let ourselves do. The Bible says that God has not given us anything more than we can handle, and I believe that. And some bad things happen, right? And we're tempted a lot of times, terribly. But we have to remember as well, and this truly, it gives me a lot of comfort. Jesus was a man. He was tempted in Matthew 4. He was ridiculed. Pick a chapter. He was ostracized. He was tortured. He was killed. Jesus went through more than probably most of us will. And yet Jesus still prevailed. And that's why I like the book of Revelation so much. Because whatever else the book may be, the entire premise of Revelation is that there is victory through Jesus. We overcome. And through that overcoming, no matter what else is going on in the world, no matter who else is doing whatever else, we can be confident in Jesus. We can be confident in His grace, in His mercy, and His love. Because without those three things, we wouldn't have a chance. But because He died, because He rose, because He loved us, we have an opportunity to not be like Belshazzar. We have an opportunity to be like Nebuchadnezzar, to rise above the smoke screen that the Satan blinds us with. And that's a beautiful thought to me. It is an encouraging thought to know that God has always been merciful. He was merciful in the 6th century to Nebuchadnezzar, and He is merciful now to us. And so, we're about out of time. I'm not going to keep you any longer. This is about when I would quit anyway. Does anybody have any thoughts, comments, questions, anything about what we covered tonight? I cannot tell you how much of a responsibility, but also I can't put into words how big of an opportunity it is to be a Christian. We have this opportunity to go to Christ, to put Him on in baptism. We have an opportunity to let Him take our sins away. And the devil is real. In today's world, a lot of people don't believe that he's real. A lot of people believe that he was a metaphor, or he was just a story that Jesus talked about. But Satan is real. Satan in the original Greek means adversary. And he is the adversary that all of us face. And it's real. But just like Daniel, and even just like Nebuchadnezzar, we don't have to give him the power that he wants, because we have something greater. We have Jesus. We have God. We have the blood of Christ that washes over us, that cleanses us. I know I say it a lot, but I love 1 John chapter 1, verse 6 through 8. We're going to mess up. We're going to fall short. We're going to sin. That is one of the only things in life that is guaranteed, that we will mess up. But that does not mean that we don't have a chance. That does not mean that we are destined to an eternity in hell because of the blood of Christ that washes over us and that makes it possible for us to be with Him forever. We're going to spend an eternity somewhere. And we can be like Belshazzar. We can be blinded to, the devil's tricks. We can be blinded by what he tells us. We can be blinded in the smoke screen. We can be like Belshazzar. We can praise the gods of technology and politics and whatever else you want to put in there. Or we can be like Daniel and we can know that God is there. We can have faith in Him and trust that He is there for us and that He is there with us. In Psalm 139, it's my favorite psalm of all time. David writes that there is no place that we can go that God is not there. There is nowhere that we can turn where God's hand cannot lead us. Tonight, if you've let the devil blind you, if you have let the devil put up his smoke screen, if you have given him power, take that back. But don't do it on your own. Put on the whole armor of God in Ephesians 6 so that you may stand against the schemes of the devil. We cannot do it alone. We are not good enough. We are not able to do it alone. But with God, all things are possible. And so tonight, if you have any need whatsoever, if tonight you have not been baptized for whatever reason, don't put that off. If tonight, in a crowd like this, maybe a more pressing matter, maybe you have fallen away. Maybe you have let sin come into your life. Maybe you have let the devil take hold. God will not give up on you. And so please do not give up on God. Tonight, if you need prayers, if you need encouragement, if you need anything at all, I encourage you to come forward now as we stand and as we sing.